midst of.
Good evening, guys. I will now call this meeting to order.
All right.
The first order of business is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. Commissioner, is there a motion to adopt the final agenda?
I move to adopt the final agenda as submitted.
Second.
Yeah, motion made and second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Our next order of business is to adopt the minutes from our April 2nd, 2024 Planning Commission meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion.
I'd second it.
Yeah, motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. We will now move on to our discussion items. The first item for discussion tonight is item 3.1, public hearing for shoreland variance at 2147 Gallery Court. I will now turn it over to our city planner, Brian McCann, for staff presentation. Then I will open the public hearing for those in the chamber that wish to speak.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Quick correction, the address is 2145 Gallery Court, so that's what we will be presenting on this evening. The property is west of County Road 43 at the end of Gallery Court. At the end of the cul-de-sac here, you can see I've highlighted the parcel in blue with the cul-de-sac on Gallery Court. It is one of two lots that was approved with the gallery at Victoria 2nd Edition, which was approved in 2006. They did have standard easements for the property assigned at the plat, so you can see a standard 10-foot easement going around the rear and side of the property, as well as a 6-foot easement. It is zoned PUD with an underlying R1 zoning, and it's adjacent to an outlot of Deer Run, which is owned by the city. So the applicant initially approached us in October of this past year with a proposed pool, at which time staff provided an incorrect area for the pool. It was evaluated for 35% impervious when it should have been evaluated for 25% impervious because of our shoreland overlay district. And we notified the landowner of this in November of 2023. And the applicant purchased the property in January of 2024. Afterwards, the property owner did approach us about a potential land sale with the adjacent outlot, which was explored but ended up being denied by City Council at a meeting last month, and a variance was suggested by the City Council for remediation. So part of this request would involve a minor subdivision, resulting in essentially a land swap of approximately 2,500 square feet to adjust the property lines to allow placement of the pool in the rear yard just off the back patio for the applicant. This would result in a net zero in property sizes, so it doesn't require any sort of purchase. It's just a land swap to shift the boundaries. This ideal location is also because of poor grades and existing improvements in other areas of the property that would make this alternative or any other alternative location difficult. As part of this request too, that would also require easement vacation for portions of those easements that I mentioned earlier. I've highlighted the areas that would have to be vacated in yellow so that you can see those easier. And then new easements would be provided for the new lot line adjustments. So an easement here and easements along this portion as well as over here. And then both of these would be contingent on the variance request, both of them being the easement vacation and the minor subdivision. As I mentioned, the applicant did propose a in allowing the property owner to be under the 25% impervious surface maximum, as well as provide sufficient space for them to get their pool. As I mentioned, that was ultimately denied and the City Council suggested the variance. So the applicant is proposing instead to exceed the maximum 25% impervious allowance. Just some additional shoreline information. It doesn't meet our bluff definition, so any pool would be exempt from bluff setbacks to remain out of the bluffed impact zone. Also, the watershed did review and will not be requiring a wetland delineation for this proposal. So currently, Without the pool, the property is at 31.9%. This is non-conforming because the property did already have this status when the applicant purchased the property earlier this year. Going over that initial 25% was not of his own doing. But after the pool would be installed, that would bring them up to 37.4% for impervious surfacing. Another thing I should mention is that the definition for impervious surface was changed with the new ordinance in 2021 to include pool surfaces. So you can see there are a couple other properties in the neighborhood that have pools as well. They weren't required to get a variance for these because the pool surface did not count towards their impervious surfacing amounts. So that's just another note to mention. And the DNR has also reviewed and provided the following comments on the request. Any stormwater over the additional 25% would need to be captured and treated, and that they couldn't just do rain gardens alone because that wouldn't accurately capture and treat all the water. And then approved engineering plans will be required for their review to meet these standards. So the variance considerations for this evening: is the request reasonable? A residential pool is a reasonable request for a residential property. Are the hardships unique and not created by the landowner? The property owner did not create the already exceeded impervious surface maximum that I mentioned at that 31%, combined with the staff error and the impervious definition adjustment after 2020. And then, will the request alter the essential character of the neighborhood? There are other pools in the neighborhood, which I mentioned, and then this would not result in an alteration to the neighborhood's character. So a public hearing is required for the variance this evening. It was noticed in the final edition of the Chanhassen Villager on April 25th. We also notified property owners within 350 feet of the request, and it was noticed on the city website and at City Hall. We have not received any comments on staff's end, and the public hearing was advertised for the easement vacation back in April. City Council did table that, so when it gets to their agenda next week, they'll have to make a decision on the easement vacation at that time. And no one showed up for that meeting either. So tonight we have three options for you as to recommend to the City Council. The first one being to approve the requests, the second being to deny the applications, and the third to table them. If you decide to recommend approval of the request, these are standard conditions that we would want to attach to the resolution, allowing for the maximum deviation, as well as no portion of it shall encroach into the drainage and utility easements or setbacks, contingency upon DNR acceptance of the engineering system, as well as building permits, and then automatically expiring if it's not initiated a year from approval. And then another contingency that we had was, since that easement vacation is still open and the applicant may decide to explore a different land sale proposal, we wanted to keep that open as well. If that is the determined route, the variance shall expire if that is approved. And then any additional modifications or expansions of the pool in the future would require an additional variance, and that the variance lasts in duration. So I have some sample motions for you this evening based on each of those options I've presented. If you decide to recommend approval, you can do it with the conditions I've just showed you, or you can add some additional conditions. It's truly up to you. So with that, staff can stand for questions, and the applicant is in the audience this evening.
All right, thank you. Does the applicant wish to speak?
Good evening, everyone. Donovan DeMarais, new owner of 2145 Gallery Court in Victoria. Thank you for your time, consideration. Nothing really I deem necessary to add to that. I think Brian kind of captured in his bullet points the general kind of context to how we got to where we're at. We did explore in depth the option of doing some sort of a land acquisition, which was talked to with the city. legal and their engineers, and that was deemed to be a viability. But then at the initial April 8th meeting, they had a bunch of conversations about it in private and determined that, you know, a variance should be at least pursued to see if that is a better outcome, either net for us or net for the city. So that's why we're here.
Thank you. I will now open the public hearing. Is there anyone in the chambers this evening who wish to comment on this item? Hearing no additional public input, commissioners, may I have a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved.
Motion, can I get a second?
I'll make a second.
Yeah, motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. The public hearing is closed. I will now open the floor for the Planning Commission to discuss. Commissioners, are there any comments or questions for the owner or staff?
I have a question or two. I noticed that when the owner purchased the property, it was already a non-conforming property in the sense that it exceeded the 25% impervious requirement. So we can't certainly hold that against you, but I noted that the city's ordinance 19-1A2 expresses an intent to limit the number and extent of non-conforming uses by prohibiting their enlargement. And my concern, commissioners, is that by approving the variance, we would be defying that intent and expanding the extent of the nonconformity to exceed the 35%. And so even if there was a staff error relying on the 35% when the property was purchased, this would take it over and above that to 37.4. I don't know if there are other options to reduce that to below 35%. One option, it sounded like, was acquiring additional property to basically increase the numerator. The other option might be, I don't know, maybe a smaller pool or some way to reduce the footprint of impervious structures.
Well, along that line, I think it's 37 and 35 is, and one of them, it shows that it's concrete, and is there a possibility of permeable pavement? You know, would that change the equation or reduce that while still allow it to be the same size?
Thanks again. Yeah, appreciate the point. Yes, that is a possibility. There, we have rough measured last week. We've had our landscape architects working on this for some time, since the new year. And yes, we can convert what right now is currently, it's not concrete in the driveway, but in the back patio, currently the pavers are not permeable, right? So we could convert those to permeable pavers, which could would get us well back to where the threshold was, to not be expanding upon what it was upon adoption by our purchase in January. So that is an option.
That was one of the things that I was reading as a kind of a trying to.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it'll you tear out what's there and then go to, the permeable versus non-permeable really comes down to, does the patio have the ability to absorb X amount of gallons of water, and so we'd be bringing in extra material below to make it be able to be a sponge to absorb. That's possible. There's obviously a cost we'd incur to do that, but that's definitely a tangible pathway.
I guess my kind of main concern is, I mean, the house was there, the lots lines were there. When you bought the house, it's either going to be allowed to have a pool when you buy it, and if you can't put the pool in, why did you buy it? Without going through, doing the land swap this has all been around since 2006 when the lot was designed and the house was built. Some houses are allowed because they have the room. Some houses you don't have the lot line, so you can't put it in. That's kind of and unfortunate of where the house was built and set and put in place.
Yeah, if I may respond. I didn't know if I'd be able to talk about the context, what brought us to the actual purchase of the subject property. Preceding this, we lived in Shorewood, right near Howard's Point Marina, across from the lake. When we started having children in 2016, my wife was raised on a lake in Yankton, South Dakota. Her entire life, her and her two sisters were raised in a boat, and their entire upbringing was on water. When we chose to wed and have children, that we too would have a water lifestyle element to raising our children. We flew one way to Houston, Texas to purchase a very expensive boat to drive it back. And since 2019, we have spent over 200 hours per year on the water, pictures, documentation, everything to evidence that we were making and fulfilling that dream to have water as a part of that life. When we got pregnant with our fourth child, we realized we couldn't stay in the home anymore due to it not having enough bedrooms and ability to grow in that house. We specifically asked in our diligence period prior to presenting an offer the city how much space was available, because purchasing this property was going to be predicated on a requirement to be able to have a pool. The city responded back with a very specific number after its diligence and its research that it had 1,393 square feet left to put a pool, and adequate enough amount to put the pool we want to put in the property. So that email was sent out on October 9th. Within less than 6 days, we made an offer, talked to our lender, got pre-approval, and offered on it with plans immediately start designing to be able to put a pool in the property. It was only upon our discovery when we did our survey that I unveiled the miscalculation from the city through our survey that indeed there was an error into how much space we actually had. Had I known that we were going to be, I'm $6,500, $7,500 in right now, and I'm running into resistance to be able to get what we were told was able to be done, we went to purchase the $2.2 million property. So here we are today, trying to just take the direction of the city to try to find a win, to try to find a solution so it can be done. So that's the context to how we got to here.
Okay.
I would view this as a bit of cleanup on aisle one, quite frankly. I mean, just the whole series of events and some of the errors, quite frankly, it's not your fault with the measuring of the lots. The neighbors aren't impacted. Excuse me. The neighbors aren't impacted. The neighbors aren't here. The neighbors have not objected. The outlot is impacted, but it's a very well defined outlot at the same time. So I would view that our work for the Planning Commission, either accepting or rejecting, but it is a matter of cleaning up a situation that had occurred, again, through no fault of your own.
Can I ask why the land purchase was denied?
Unfortunately, it was discussed during closed session, and I don't believe we can speak on the reasonings why in a public meeting.
Cool.
It makes it hard when we're trying to guess on the actual reasons to try to create a solution.
I mean, to me, that's the most obvious solution, and one that was denied for unknown factors. So
There was, as a part of that, I was encouraged to make an offer of compensation. I simply used a tax mill rate. I used the tax assessor's mill rate to establish the value prorated times the amount that we're trying to purchase, thinking that we would have an engagement and some back and forth of like deriving at maybe a different number, which we were completely fine. That conversation never occurred. It's yet to happen. I'm still open and welcome to that. To me, it seems like and I'm saying this to the point of being a fool, because the variance option has us not having to acquire at a very expensive mill rate to what the city actually wants, which I've only recently learned that is much higher than where we started. But I would have expected there could be some back and forth to derive a win-win number, and then basically the city gets that amount, the lot lines get adjusted, we're under the 25% impervious to bring everything into compliance, and everyone's happy, you know, the pool gets to be where it is. It's swampland. If I'm welcome anybody to come out there and see it, it's a swamp that we're purchasing, so we're not buying prime land. And it brings everything into check. But again, I'm just doing whatever's been directed to me by the people that are running the city. So I'm all about trying to find a solution, whatever that might be. I was told that we want to go this path, so I immediately did an application the next day and said, I thought the cities don't like variances. So I will do whatever you tell me. I just want to get to the solution.
Brian, can I ask what this outlot, is this, you know, it says Deer Run outlot, is this City of Victoria's land? Is this Deer Run land? What is this?
City of Victoria.
Is it the city?
Correct. Yes, it is city land, and the portion that we're talking about behind the home is actually, well, this was all outlotted for wetland preservation, while the wetland has receded over time, making this available space for purchase and construction of a pool.
Do we have the topo lines? Is that one? I mean,
I'm sure I do. It would just take me a minute to pull up, and I would have
yeah.
to.
And in terms of how it would be developed, again, it's contingent on the DNR's approval in terms of the water mitigation and retention.
On the variance pathway, yes.
Yes.
Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, yeah.
Is your driveway impervious?
So it is straight concrete.
So one is the land swap and two is,
I'm just brainstorming, you know, rip up half the driveway, put down pervious driveway garbage. I don't know if that works in the state of Minnesota very well, but
Well, the impervious parts, I mean, you still got a land swap, you still gotta get the room,
Yeah,
there's still the
lot
land
line.
swap first before getting.
still gotta get the.
Aaron.
land is the key.
Yeah. Aaron, commissioners, just for some additional context too, the applicant would only be allowed to use 2% of the total lot area for pervious pavers. Everything after that would account for impervious. And that's in our shoreline ordinance. I just discovered this recently myself, so. Pervious
Repeat that one more
pavers,
time?
yeah. Pervious pavers only would count for 2% of the total lot area. Anything over that 2% would still be considered impervious, even if they are consisting of pervious pavers.
Gotcha.
oh,
Yeah.
I was just thinking, you know, a couple lines of, well, whatever.
The plastic.
So,
Well, plastic is considered impervious too.
What's that?
Plastic is considered impervious, so you got like plastic underneath your landscape rock. It's technically it's impervious surface also.
Yeah, I think it's just fabric. But
It's, right, most companies have switched to, for that reason, but
based on the calculation of what the, going back to, and it was tabled, I didn't get a straight on the record decline, it was tabled, the outlot portion purchase piece, to go this pathway, and we table that, so then when we come around next week on the 14th, they could be looking at kind of both pathways and try to have an end solution, so we can still meet our timelines and obligations to the landscape companies and pool installers for the year. For the spring install in the last week in May. To me, it's a substantial, I mean, it's gonna be a check to the city for like $38,000. So based on the mill rate that they gave that they would be wanting. And so it's a huge number, that it's a big number. But again, if it gets, to me, it seems like the logical solution, because it's really fund money for the city. We rectify an old problem that was adopted. Everything is underneath the 25% limit. And then now with this new thing about 2%, things are gonna have to get toggled again about whether it's permeable or not. It's not gonna benefit, I mean, so it's like, so I've just gotta rerun math on that, because that's, you know, it was approximately 2,000 of additional square footage, being the pool counts against you at 880. So it was like another let's call it 900, like 1,100 and change of like patio area around there. But if only 2% counts to the good on that, I mean, it's gonna have to be just a strip maybe around the pool, and the pool's sitting on the shoreline setback piece, is that within an area from the edge of the property line in? Because there is the area in the south patio that is pavers that aren't permeable, that could get converted.
For permeable setback for permeable,
Yeah.
is that what you mean?
Is
It's not a setback restriction. It's a lot coverage restriction. So, and going back to the council's discussion, it was a lot of the discussion, I guess I should say, revolves around not wanting to set a precedent of property owners adjacent to city-owned outlots being able to come forward and requesting land purchases.
Well,
So,
right, that's the other thing. I mean, you're either way, you're setting a precedent
Sure.
with whether you're doing a land swap. Your land swap it's gaining you access
To the prime spot.
to the back line, but it's not giving you impervious surface because
We're still at that, yeah.
you still have, which it was non-conforming when you bought it, so.
It feels like a lot, to me, honest, like just, and I'm a fool for saying it, feels like a lot of spread above what the threshold is to ask for variance. I mean, I just had a neighbor, like, they had to cut out a part of their third driveway stall to get to their driveway. So, I mean, I don't feel like the good guy neighbor just came into town and now I'm not looking for exceptions. Like, I just want to get it back to compliant, and then if it even means I've got to write a check to get it back to there, so then we can do the thing we plan to do, because I went to purchase the house otherwise.
What's
The boat's sold, it's gone.
the DNR filtration hasn't really been addressed either, or?
We was notified to us and our civil engineer surveyor, and they said, yeah, we would create a system that met the requirements of the recommending body, which is the DNR, on that.
I have no idea what that might cost, but does that problem go away if you're able to do the land purchase?
I mean, that system has been estimated at, it could be $10,000 to $20,000 for that system. It's got to be, and then there's a whole bunch of checks and balances that have to happen with that too. So this variance thing triggers other things that are like kind of collateral damage byproduct to it, because like, oh, now we need to put this system in. Who's going to babysit and mirror that and make sure that's still working, and it's going to be hooked to power, so it's going to run into power, and it's going to go down into a little thing and then get pumped and ejected into the swamp. Like, it already naturally drains into the swamp anyways. The pitch, I mean, it's a 10 to 13 foot fall from.
That's why I was asking about that.
and Chair and Commissioner Otterstetter, to your question, do those standards or those engineering requirements go away with a land purchase? Essentially, yes, if he gets back to that 25%, there's no additional engineering to capture that stormwater.
Probably the most cost-effective solution if it's available. We don't know if it is.
Well,
Yeah,
we would
and
have to-
I'm almost cost effective is almost out the window at this point. I mean, I keep running into
relative
new information every time I come to this thing. So it's like, I just want to know what's everything that's known right now, and can we find a solution within it that, yeah, you said exactly it, Mr. Coons, that, yeah, there's going to be an optics perception anyways, but I mean, I'll sit out here all week long and see how many of the neighbors are lining up to go write $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 checks to buy part of swamp in their backyard so they can just call it theirs and pay tax on it into perpetuity while they live there. Not going to happen. So I mean, but we just want to get to the solution, that's all.
And so that is, we would be denying in terms of a vote to give direction to the council to reconsider a land swap. Because the variance triggers
Land purchase.
that's that middle path. That's the one that actually denies you the variance to put you back in that direct with the city.
Or another option would be, one of the three was to table it and not make a decisive decision on either of it now.
We could, my apologies.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, Chair and Commissioners, if you do go the route of tabling, then we wouldn't be able to bring it to City Council on Monday, May 13th, which would further delay the applicant's plans. So.
Yeah, we don't want to do that.
What is a deny? That's what I was hearing.
I'd rather take more time and have, in an ideal world, have both options still in play and have the deciding final vote of the city council make the call based on your guys' input. I mean, you're talking about things, I wasn't in the private meeting, so I don't even know the exchange and dialogue that was going on. It's a mystery to me, and it gets to be a mystery, which is fun.
We weren't in it either.
Yeah, but you're bringing up things that likely occurred in their brainstorming session, so.
And Chair and Commissioners, just going back to my presentation again, if you decide to recommend approval of the variance, these are the conditions that we would apply, and I'm pointing at number 6 here, because if the alternative is approved where the applicant wants to pursue that land swap, the variance would become null and void. So if city council approves the variance and you as the applicant decide you want to go back and try again on the land sale route, if that gets approved, then this variance is null and void. So that's a potential option as well.
Thanks for restating that.
And the variance is still pending the land swap that the city council has to approve also.
Correct.
Punt or?
Yeah, so even if we technically approve it, it's still, the city
Can reject it.
council can reject the land swap, and then you're,
And Chair and Commissioners, just keep in mind as well that this was the proposed remediation by the city council instead of the land sale. So
was to do the land swap.
was to do the variance.
Yeah.
The variance was proposed by the city council instead of going the land sale route.
Right, but the variance with the land swap or variance, just the variance?
Just the variance was what was discussed at the time, but from my understanding, the applicant has approached one or multiple members of the city council and discussed the land swap aspect as well, and there was no concern with that route.
My biggest problem with the setting precedent narrative is I've been involved with a number of situations where the city, this might be shooting someone in the foot, has tried to give away city-owned land to homeowners associations so they don't have to take care of it. A variance in and of itself is not setting a precedent that is overall encompassing for the entire city. It is simply that, a single variance for a situation. And while this property doesn't necessarily fall on a bluff situation, how close are we to the actual water line, if you don't mind me asking?
The actual water line itself is actually a significant distance away on either side. I mean, there's wetlands here, but without a wetland delineation, I can't be sure on the actual water line distance.
So it's not like we're building this pool within 50 feet of a waterway that is going to be significantly affected. Some of the grounds on the way to we pass through an entire neighborhood before we get to the location on the west side. Would that be the west side?
East.
kind of-
Is the far side.
I'm just trying to think as I'm playing down hole number
Yeah, number 5.
5 there.
Not gonna see it.
I mean, well, yeah, and so
It's got a long ways, if something were to, if the pool were to leak and dump all the water.
Yeah.
It's not,
dumps all the water, dumps oil, everything goes crazy. It's not going to actually get to any water locations quickly. Will it sink all the way through and affect our water table at some point in time? Probably not, but we have to somewhat be cognizant of that type of a situation. I don't know.
Could you pull up the three, Brian, the 3 recommendations, proposals?
I'm ready if somebody wants to make a motion.
Yeah, I would make a motion to recommend to the city council approval of the request with the staff proposed conditions and all of the things that were outlined.
motion?
I'll make a second that.
Yeah, motion made by Commissioner Iverson, second by Commissioner Rame. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 4-1. Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
You-
Final item for discussion tonight is a public hearing for preliminary plat, conditional use permits, shoreland variance, annexation, and preliminary plan unit development for Victoria South Residential Development. I will now turn it over to City Planner Brian McCain for a staff presentation, and then I will open a public hearing for those in the chamber this evening that wish to speak.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Yes, tonight we have a proposal from Golden Valley Land Company for the Victoria South Residential Development. This request does include preliminary plat, preliminary planned unit development, annexation, conditional use permit, shoreland conditional use permit, and shoreland variance applications. So the major subdivision process, which most of you are aware of, is outlined in 3 phases. First being sketch plat with a neighborhood meeting and a preliminary plat as the second, which is what the applicant is applying for this evening. And then the third and final stage being the final plat. So the location area, it is a single parcel west of Highway 11, also south of the railroad and the Marsh Hollow development. It's a little over 24 acres in size, and the applicant tonight is proposing a 144-unit apartment building and 134 townhome units. The existing conditions for the property, it's currently a vacant farm site with fields, trees, and your standard farm buildings. There's the railroad to the north with Highway 11 to the east, as I mentioned. There are some wetlands on site. And then in the northeast corner of the property is a portion of the West Chaska Creek. So the Planning Commission reviewed the sketch plat request back in January. Some of the comments that were discussed were regarding right-of-way, pedestrian connections, some aspects of the apartment building, such as parking standards, the EV stations, as well as the unit types and number of specific units regarding bedroom sizes. And then also impervious surfacing amounts and the Carver County watershed review and buffer requirements. The City Council also reviewed this during a workshop on January 22nd. So here is a general site plan of the property. So you can see the 134 townhomes on the large loop going through the property, with the apartment building on the southeast portion of the site. And then here is the preliminary plat, which is up for consideration tonight, with the apartment building as a separate lot and block, and then the remaining townhomes as separate lots and blocks as well. This is a phasing plan that staff had received a few months ago for the proposed development. I'm not sure if this is still accurate, but this is to give you a general guidance of how they would be planning to phase the development over the next few years, with the first phase being a portion of the townhomes and a second phase being additional townhomes with the apartment building, and then the third and final phase being the remaining townhomes on the west side of the development. So as I mentioned, they're proposing 2 types of land uses here, one being the apartment building and the remaining area for the townhomes. So some of the applications this evening, the preliminary plat, the annexation, the variance to our shore impact zone requirements, conditional use permits to exceed the maximum 100 units for multifamily residential in our R4 district, and to have a multifamily residential shoreland PUD, which is a standard of our shoreland overlay district, and then the preliminary rezoning to planned unit development with underlying R4 zoning. So our comp plan guides this property for high-density residential and open space. The high-density residential has an allowed density range of 12 to 36 units per acre. The proposal tonight falls just under 14 units per acre. Additionally, I thought it was worth noting that there is flex employment guided area to the south, as well as the railroad right-of-way in the gray to the north. And even beyond that, some low-density residential, which is the Marsh Hollow development. And we did contact the Metropolitan Council on this request, and they received or provided guidance that a comprehensive plan amendment would not be required for this phase development. Excuse me. Annexation and the conditional use for the R4. The property is currently within Lake Town Township. That's why it does not have a zoning designation currently. When a property is annexed into the city, it automatically has an agricultural zoning classification established. So what they would propose would be the rezoning as well as the annexation. Annexations are, they do have to go to the township for approval, as well as us and the Office of Administrative Hearings. So the proposed rezoning to planned unit development with the PUD and the underlying R4 high-density residential. Our R4 does require a conditional use permit for apartment buildings that contain more than 100 units. So that is part of the application this evening as well, since they are proposing 144 units. Going into our shoreline standards, they are looking at the conditional use permit for the PUD, as well as a variance request for our shore impact zone standards. Specifically related to open space, we have a requirement for 70% of the shore impact zone to be preserved in its natural or existing state. So looking at the shoreland area specifically that we're talking about, the standard is 300 feet from a tributary, so it just runs through a portion of the northeast corner. They provided all the area that lies within the shoreland area, which only results in about 14 units, which does meet our residential shoreline PUD requirements, where they have to do a tier analysis to determine the maximum size of units allowed, and they're well under the threshold for that. And then regarding the shore impact zone, which they're seeking the variance for, 70% of the shore impact zone, abbreviated SIZ, must be preserved in its natural state, and with a reduction of 50% of that required setback. So they're proposing temporarily 10 feet for a deviation of what would result in 43.75 feet based on the math and requirements of our shoreland and the reduction in the required setback. And I believe this is a temporary request. They do intend to reestablish the area back to a natural state after construction. And the DNR has reviewed this request and commented on the necessity of a variance. Going into the design, we'll talk about the height, the impervious surface, as well as some architectural details and building facades and color. So for the townhomes, we haven't received an official application for site plan and building material review, so this is all conceptual. This will occur with the final plat application. The buildings are anticipated to be less than 35 feet, which would meet our requirements, and they are requesting a deviation for impervious for the townhome lots to go above the 75% to 95%. This is fairly typical with townhomes. The buildings usually only take up the amount of the lot that they need, so this isn't over the top deviation, I would say. Also, it's worth noting that they are proposing 18 units for some single level living. So these are the ones on the end, on the image on the top of your screen. They have further space in the back to allow for one floor living for individuals that have some difficulty getting upstairs. So it provides just another type of housing option. And then you can see the modern design fairly similar to the Marsh Hollow townhomes just to the north. And then the apartment building, This is also just conceptual, so we'll need another application concurrent with final plat for the apartment building. They are proposing 4 stories, about 55 feet in height, and the impervious for this would result in approximately 62%. I believe that is also in our allowed range. And then looking at the site plan for parking, pedestrian connections, parkland dedication requirements, landscaping, tree preservation, and signage. So parking, we'll start with the townhomes. So they are proposing 268 enclosed stalls. As you saw in the architectural renderings a few slides back, they are proposing 2 stall garages for each unit, as well as some driveway space. So that actually results in approximately 4 spaces per dwelling. They are also providing some areas of guest parking, approximately 45 spaces throughout the development for additional guest parking for those residents. And then moving on to the apartment building, they're proposing 144 surface parking stalls for general use, and then 129 enclosed spaces, which would be reserved for residents of the apartment building. Looking at the pedestrian connections, they are showing some sidewalks around the outer loops of the townhomes. The sidewalk connections are designated in red, with the neighborhood trail connections outlined in yellow, and then the regional trail connection adjacent to Highway 11 shown in the blue, running north to south. I should also note as well that they are showing sidewalks and paths along the collector road, which would come off of Victoria Drive and head south through the site. Looking at our parkland dedication requirements, they would be required to provide roughly 6.5 acres of parkland dedication land. So a cash fee is anticipated in lieu of this land. And then just noting that our comprehensive plan does highlight this area for a neighborhood park, but the Parks and Rec Committee reviewed this and did not request a neighborhood park with this development. Moving on to landscaping. Overall, they are planting 132 trees and 264 shrubs, including boulevard plantings every 35 feet. On the plan, they've indicated, not shown, but that required foundation plantings will be provided around the apartment building as well as the townhome buildings. And then a 40-foot buffer is shown along highways 11 with 2-to-1 slopes. Our code does say that the standard is 3-to-1, but that deviations could be approved by the city council if requested. And then also worth noting that no buffers are shown to the north, which is adjacent to the railroad, or to the south, which is adjacent to the future flex employment growth area. Moving on to tree preservation, they're proposing to remove 24 of 78 significant trees out there, resulting in a 71% save. Excuse me. Anything over 20% they have to provide remediation for, so they're proposing 140 inches in replacement trees, which results in approximately 47 trees with that 3-inch diameter. Moving on to lighting and signage. They do have no on-street parking signs throughout the private streets, as well as the collector road and that private loop that I mentioned, as well as the private drives. So typical street lights are also shown at intersections, and 2 monument signs are proposed on the site, one near the clubhouse and one near the apartment development. So those will be evaluated in the future with building permits. And with this, I will pass it over to our city engineer.
I think you've picked where to put me so you can have a break. Could I have the mouse? And I'm going to just steal that so you don't have to think. Good evening. I am here to cover the topics noted here on this slide. So we're going to talk about site traffic impacts, access. We're going to talk a little bit about the streets, and then grading, stormwater management, and utilities. So hopefully I will answer any questions you have. And I'm going to do that graphically with each of the site plans. So what I wanted to highlight on this slide, and I can't see my mouse, but County Road 11 is adjacent to this site. We probably talked about this a little bit at the sketch plat. The City Council approved a resolution of support of a corridor study that was completed for County Road 11 from 10 up to Marsh Lake Road that we completed a number of years ago with the county to figure out what the appropriate access would be onto County Road 11 when development occurred. So what the developer has submitted here is consistent with what is in the plans for improving County Road 11. I should note that currently 11 is planned to be improved in 2027 in our endless puzzle pieces of planned transportation projects within the city of Victoria. So everything that's being proposed here is consistent with what those plans are. In the long-range plan, this location does become a right-in, right-out only intersection, and the full access intersection would be in the flex employment space to the south. So the developer is working with the county. I participated in a meeting this week with their traffic engineer and the county to talk about what the interim conditions should be associated with their connection, and then long-term, if it would be possible to have the intersection as a three-quarter intersection. So all of those conversations are ongoing and favorable, and it'll be continued to be worked through before the final plat process comes forward. But they are showing a collector road through the site. Back at the sketch plat phase, we did have them provide a potential roadway layout for the property to the south, just so we could have a greater level of confidence that the location of Street A doesn't create any challenges for the property to the south, and so no concerns there. Related then to the other streets within the neighborhood, there was a whole lot of discussion during the sketch plat phase about whether the city wants to have these roads be private streets. The direction provided from the City Council was to take a close look at the idea of, in this particular circumstance, having the roads be private instead of public streets. What I should note for the Planning Commission is that the city, from a relative perspective, we don't have a lot of townhome developments yet in the city, and over the years we've tried, I would say, different configurations for how to provide access to these streets and finding the balance between public or private streets. We did some research on what's being constructed in other communities, and what's shown here is consistent with some projects we've seen approved around the metro area in terms of having the townhome property served by private streets. So the developer, in response to the direction from the City Council, is showing all of the streets serving the townhomes as private. They're 24 feet wide versus our standard roadway would be 28 feet wide. Did you give me a picture of that? So, typically we would have a 28-foot wide road. They're proposing a 24 feet wide road, and that then results in no parking being permitted on either side. So parking would be restricted to accommodate that reduced width. Some other changes from what would be a standard street, which would typically be located in a 60-foot right-of-way. The developer is proposing sidewalk on only one side. So again, that starts to, typically we would see in a townhome neighborhood, historically we've seen sidewalks on both sides. The council was agreeable at the sketch plat phase to only having sidewalk on one side. So they're, using some of those modifications to pull that right-of-way space down a little bit, what would be typical right-of-way. So the other element that the city spent quite a bit of time, staff, discussing is the sanitary sewer, stormwater, and water lines located within the street. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the utility slide. One thing we did just want to highlight, and we just took some measurements off of the plat. So, typically on a project, we would have a 60-foot right-of-way with a 10-foot utility easement on the back side of it. which essentially would result in 80 feet of corridor width from easement to easement where we locate sanitary sewer, water main, stormwater pipes, gas line, telephone line, Metronet line, Mediacom line, whoever comes around next wanting to put a line in the ground. Typically it'll be located within that footprint. In this scenario, we are reducing the space between the buildings. We took some measurements here on the plat. We had some locations where we were looking at 65 feet from the building pad to building pad, where you will have all of that infrastructure located. Because of that tightness then, I guess I'm going to jump ahead on the utilities. City staff is recommending that the sanitary sewer services and water services be privately maintained from the main to the home. So typically in a public street neighborhood, the city would maintain the portion of the service within the right-of-way to the main, but we are recommending that as part of this move to a private street that those services be privately maintained to the main. And part of the reason for that is that water service leaks happen. They aren't uncommon where we'll have a service leak. And so the Public Works Department doesn't want to have to be digging in people's really front yards right outside of their house to repair a curb stop. So outside of that, we had some discussion about whether the water main and the sanitary sewer main themselves should also be private. That was discussed at the council meeting at sketch plat. And staff is recommending that the sewer line and water lines be publicly maintained for health safety reasons, so we can make sure they're being properly flushed and cleaned and maintained. The stormwater pipes, however, we would recommend those to be private because they're collecting runoff from private streets. So a lot of information there. So if you have questions when we get through, we'll be happy to talk about them. Stormwater management, the development is within Carver County WMO. The developer's engineer has been working with the WMO on these plans to make sure that they're compliant. They are showing 2 stormwater management facilities, one adjacent to County Road 11 and the other one serving the private streets. Because this one on the left is serving the private streets, we would also be recommending that the homeowners association be responsible for the maintenance of this basin. The city, on the other hand, would continue to be responsible for the maintenance of this basin as it's collecting road from the county road and the collector road that serves the development. Utilities, so utilities to the site, so that was touched on in the staff report. So sanitary sewer and water have been extended up to the railroad tracks as part of the Marsh Hollow development. So the developer is prepared to bring the sewer and water lines underneath the railroad tracks. And then those are trunk, so larger diameter lines that will run through the site and be available to serve the rest of our growth area. So that would be installed as part of the project. And then they have lateral sewer and water lines serving the rest of the development, which I sneak peek and talked about already relative to the streets. You will note in the staff report, and we covered this at the sketch plat phase, well number 6 does need to be operational and available use as we continue to grow outside of the city limits. The well is complete, the pump house is approaching completion, and we are working through the permitting process to be able to use that well. So we're just continuing through the process. The developer's aware of the timing, and we've been working through that essentially concurrently. As they go through the entitlement process and the approval process, we're going through ours. So what you'll see in the conditions is a condition that we would recommend that final plat not be approved until we know the specific timeline of that, so we can make sure that we don't have people moving in before we're comfortable with being able to use that well.
Back to me. So internally, we have our fire chief, our public works, as well as our building department review similar requests. We meet weekly to discuss new developments. So this is one that has been talked about for the last several weeks with our team. Additionally, externally, we have the Minnesota DNR reviewing this because of that portion within the Shoreland Overlay District. Carver County, because it's adjacent to the county highway, which Carver County has not provided any comments to us yet because of some staffing changeover that they have there, as well as the Carver County Watershed Management Organization. So going back to the planned unit development process, the purpose is to allow innovative, creative, and flexible development that is sensitive to environmental, cultural, and economic considerations in partnership with public values as outlined in our comp plan. This is taken straight from code. You saw this slide at our sketch plat, and so you know the process is input on acceptability at sketch plat, and then the details approved during the preliminary plat, which we're at tonight, and the ordinance adopted at final plat. And just to cover what has been proposed by the applicant regarding deviations, I'll go through this topic by topic. The first one being the sidewalks. We have a standard in one of our code sections that said sidewalks or trails may be required along both sides of all streets and areas where residential developments equal or exceeds 3 units per acre. That is the type of development that we are looking at in this instance, and I highlighted the may be required, but this standard has been used in the past for other developments. So it's not required, it's a may be required. Regarding the right-of-way, reduced right-of-way may be granted by the City Council by reasons of exceptional topography or other physical conditions. So as Kara touched on briefly, the applicant is proposing a 75-foot wide corridor, which would be building front to the other building front across the street. Just for reference, a standard public right-of-way is that 60 feet plus the 10-foot wide easements on each side of the street, and additionally a 30-foot front setback for each side of the street. So really, we would be looking at, do the math, 120 times 2 plus 10 times 2 plus 30 times 2. So a significant distance compared to that 75-foot wide corridor presented. Regarding landscape buffers, as I touched on, there aren't any buffers to the north or south adjacent to the railroad and flex employment areas respectively, and they are showing the 40-foot buffers which have the 2-to-1 slopes instead of 3-to-1, which I talked about briefly. Regarding the parkland section, this is taken straight from our code. For parkland dedication, it's to uphold the goals and intent of the park plan in congruence with the comprehensive plan. In this instance, a future neighborhood park is shown on our comp plan but not proposed with this development. Moving on to the apartment parking enclosed, as I mentioned, they're about 15 spaces deficient for the enclosed parking standards for the apartment building. And then moving on to townhome setbacks, they're proposing a reduction in the front setbacks for the townhomes by 5 feet and various patio reductions for the townhome lots. And then clubhouse setbacks, they're proposing a front setback reduction from 45 feet to 20 feet. And then going back to the townhomes, the impervious surface maximum that I mentioned, our standard is 75% per lot, and the applicant is proposing 95%. So this is a similar slide as I shown to you at sketch plat again. Just some considerations which were included in the staff report. Is another alternative more viable? Should a higher density product be considered? And I go back to this, rezonings are discretionary. We have the most control over our zoning code and our comp plan. So if there is a development that isn't meeting our standards or that the planning commission or the city council does not agree with, you do not have to approve a rezoning. Moving on to are the development deviations acceptable? Are there any other particular amenities that should be considered for this project? Is the site functionality acceptable? Will there be any potential noise impacts with the proximity to the railroad? I believe we took some measurements. I believe the closest unit is about 90 feet away from the center line of the railroad tracks. So just keep that in mind for consideration. And then are there any other concerns about the reduced, I'll call it corridor instead of right-of-way. So moving on, public hearing. We did publish for a public hearing this evening in the final edition of the Chanhassen Villager on April 25th, and it was mailed to property owners within 350 feet of the development's borders, and it was also posted online and at City Hall. Excuse me. So tonight we have 3 recommendation options for you to consider. The first being to approve the recommendation to the City Council to approve the preliminary plat and associated applications. The second being to recommend denial, and the third to recommend tabling. And here we have a list of suggested conditions of approval. Most of these are pretty standard to our past preliminary plat resolutions for approval. I will note the last 2. Well number 6, as Kara mentioned, must be completed and permitted for pumping prior to final plat approval, and then any other conditions that the Planning Commission or City Council would like to include for consideration with the final plat. So with that, I have sample motions on the screen for you tonight for each types of those recommendations, and staff can stand for questions, and the applicant is also in the audience this evening.
Thank you, Brian. Does the applicant wish to speak?
Good evening, Chairman, Planning Commissioners. My name is Matt Pavick. I'm one of the developers and the engineer on the project. We appreciate the city's consideration of our development. We've been working on it for a couple of years now. We were here back in January with sketch plan with a couple of optional styles of development for this site. One was a townhouse project that was more typical, like a Marsh Hollow or a Whispering Hills project. And then option B, we'll call it, was what with the private streets. And that's what was more favorable at the time between Planning Commission and City Council. So we've moved forward with that concept, which is shown here. A couple of things that we should point out about our project, and the fact it's a PUD with a lot of different benefits that we think we should highlight here. So with this layout, we're able to provide over 50% open space. We have a large green corridor that runs through the middle of the site. If you could switch to the next slide. So this shows our network of sidewalks, trails throughout the site. We do have the sidewalk on the single side, but we thought a good alternative to that was to continue to keep that side a little bit narrower and expand the green space in the backyards, and then provide a trail through that backyard. So you still have that looping connectivity that runs through the site, even with missing that second sidewalk. If you could switch to the next one. So this highlights kind of the green infrastructure of the site. We've got the ponds, the wetlands, the creek, all the existing wooded buffer that exists along the railroad track that we're preserving. As long as the new buffers along County Road 11. If you could go to the next one, please. And then this just highlights our central green kind of corridor amenity space. So this is all PUD type benefits to the project. The trails, playground, community center, fire pit, large green kind of common open space, rec area, dog park. So all those nice amenities that focus on the natural resources in the area. You know, we've got bench overlooks looking over the ponds and wetlands on the east and west side. So we can talk a little bit about any of the deviations if you want to. We feel they're pretty minor, but we could get into those. We also have representatives here that are from the townhome builder, the apartment builder, that could answer questions about the products and those sorts of things. And then could you switch to the next slide? So then here is just a rendering, a conceptual clubhouse that would exist on the property. And then we've got, again, the renderings of some of the products here as well. So, so since our sketch plan meeting, like I said, we've done a couple of minor improvements. One was the adding of the single level living, 18 units into the project to help diversify some of that housing. We added the buffers along County Road 11. That was one, we're showing a 2-to-1 slope versus a 3-to-1. The advantage there is it can get a little bit higher, and then it's an unmaintained vegetation, so we don't have to mow it. We think it looks more natural, fits into the style of the landscaping that we're proposing on the project. Other than that, I can stand here for questions. We concur with all of the city engineers' comments. We've been working hard with them to come up with a maintainable infrastructure that'll work here with the private streets. So we agree with all of those recommendations as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now open the public hearing. Is there anyone in the chambers tonight that would like to comment on this item? Hearing no additional public input, commissioners, may I have a motion to close the public hearing?
I move to close the public hearing.
Motion made and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion carries. The public hearing is closed. I will now open the floor for the Planning Commission to discuss. You have any questions for staff or the builder?
I got questions for Carol right off the bat. How many other developments or properties in the city of Victoria do we have a situation where the water line to the domicile is not under city responsibility?
So this would be the first.
Okay.
In all other circumstances, we don't have a lot of neighborhoods with private streets, but we do have some. Garden Path would be one that has a 24-foot wide road. The streets are privately maintained. That one's a little bit different because it's a lot less dense. This product is a lot higher density than what the Garden Path neighborhood is. I don't recommend you drive down the streets unless you're going to see a neighbor there because the streets are private. But we came up with this recommendation for a change after running into some issues that we've found on some of these townhome projects. So the Whispering Hills example that the developer's engineer referenced, we have those finger streets, stub streets that we call them, was the layout we were coming up with for finding that balance between public and private streets. And what we're finding is with those curb stops, when they leak and we go to repair them, you're suddenly dealing with somebody's flower bed, somebody's, in one particular case in Whispering Hills, we were dealing with their air conditioning unit. And it didn't feel appropriate that public tax dollars were having to go to restore somebody's front yard to that extent. In a normal situation with a public street with a 60-foot right-of-way, the curb stop is at the easement line, so you don't have as much private infrastructure near the curb stop. So that is a recommendation. Certainly the council will have to decide if they're comfortable with that change of having it be private all the way to the main, but that's staff's recommendation.
Gotcha. And in this particular case, based on the renderings I saw, we're not talking about a flower bed that can be replaced with a couple $100 of dirt and flowers. We're talking about concrete/asphalt driveway that we're digging through. And I guess my challenge with this is we get a leak. Is it water or is it sewer? And then we're there digging it up and we're like, whoop, it's not sewer. That's a water leak. We're out of here. Coming from somebody who owns one of these places or one of these condominiums, so the city's dug it up, it's not their problem. Now we got somebody else coming in, or vice versa, and dealing with it. I just think it would be a complete nightmare. So, however, that homeowners association works with dealing with that and how those people are going to deal with those actual areas. I mean, is that common around the Twin Cities? Do you know? I know it's kind of a
the developer's engineer might be able to speak to that more than we can. As I noted, we're in our infancy really as a city in having these types of neighborhoods. And I have cautioned anyone who will listen to me talk that we really need to move to what a standard is going to be, so we aren't having to work through this on a plat by plat basis. So, internally we've been talking about, okay, is this going to set our standard? Is Whispering Hills going to set our standard? Is Marsh Hollow going to set our standard? I think we need to do some work, off, not part of any project, to decide what makes sense. I did speak with the city engineer, the assistant city engineer from Chanhassen. They historically had all the sewer and water be privately maintained, so including the main, for a number of years, but made the decision in the last few years to change to have the sewer main and the water main be public, which is what we're recommending. But yeah, they weren't able to give me any specific examples about what the experience is like on the townhome owner's side in dealing with that. To your question about just working through whose problem it is, our Public Works Department is very proactive in helping residents solve problems. So certainly if there were to be any signs of a leak, there's no doubt in my mind that they would help troubleshoot, to help those folks figure out what they're dealing with and help them, answer any questions that a contractor might have to come out and fix it. The common space would all be owned by the HOA, so it would be the HOA that would be dealing with it, not the individual unit owner.
Common space being the driveway
Yeah.
for each
Right.
house. Correct. It's better than 4 people having to pay for it, get to divide it up amongst everybody else. Right in, right out, off of the street. What does County Road 11's new development look like for this particular spot? Does it look like a semaphore, or is it going to be just right in, right out?
So essentially, the plan for 11 is a continuation of the improvements we completed adjacent to Marsh Hollow and Hunters Brook. So you'd have median, an extension of the median from where it ends today down to the intersection of 10 and 11, which is currently planned to be a signal, but they'll evaluate with design if a roundabout would be more appropriate. So with the right in, right out, the developer is requesting to the county that they consider a 3/4 intersection, so you would still be able to make the left-hand turn in. Part of the challenge for the developer is really the timing of the development to the south. They have no control over. So, in an ideal situation, that road would be getting constructed today and looped back to 11 through the property to the south to where the full access intersection will be on 11. But we typically don't mandate that property owners that aren't ready to develop have roadway connections through them. So, the timing until that development occurs is unknown. We could have an application. Once utilities are approved to get to the site boundary, we could have the landowner to the south come in with an application for sketch plat and be wanting to move forward, or they could choose to sit on their land for a period of time. So that's some of that complexity, because the developer is, of course, concerned about having only a right in, right out for an expended period of time would not really be viable for them to serve their development. So that's why they're proactively working on traffic impact analysis and meeting with the county public works staff about what makes sense there in the interim.
And the number 3 concern of all your Victoria residents are, how is this thing going to be connected to our trail system?
Yeah, so as part of the project, they are showing a trail along County Road 11, but similar to was the case with Marsh Hollow and Hunters Brook, we'll build that trail with the road project, because otherwise we run the risk of the trail not being in the right place and needing to be ripped out in 2 years when the road project comes in. So that will tie in to the trail that's been built on 11. In terms of connectivity to the rest of the city, so the roundabout project that's planned at Marsh Lake Road and Pioneer Trail and County Road 11 includes a trail connection from Hunters Brook all the way up to Lake Town. Now, the council will need to make the decision if we can fund that to build it with the planned construction next year. So once we, the bid package will set that up as an alternate bid to build and pave that trail, and the council will have to make the decision if we can fund it based on what the project costs come in at. But that's the plan. If it didn't get built with the roundabout project, essentially we'd be deferring it until the Schmieg property would develop at some point in the future, should the Schmiegs decide to sell their land for development, or the city would have to come back and do a separate project. The grading for the trail would be completed with the project, and they are acquiring enough right-of-way to fit the trail with the road improvements. So making progress there.
Do you have any concerns with the buffer and the 2-to-1 versus 3-to-1 as far as runoff, drainage, or any of that sort of stuff?
I do not. The Lake Town, like the early editions of Lake Town, just north of Red Fox, those have a 2-to-1 buffer. I think it's effective in terms of not having it maintained. It hasn't been a problem. And that's a buffer that the city maintains. In this case, they'd be HOA maintained, so.
Great. Now let's bring up fire. I know it's not Chief Hager anymore, but any concerns at all from them regarding access to all of these places and the private roads and an ability to get a truck through there?
Yeah, so the developer's engineer did provide truck turning movements based on our fire truck size, and we're able to demonstrate that fire trucks can circulate the streets as they're proposed. There was certainly concern about the fact that we're going to have this many of units on a single entry point until such time as the development proceeds to the south. So what the developer has talked with the interim fire chief about is deferring some of the landscaping that's planned right at the entryway, so that, you know, essentially if we can get into there, then we can get through multiple points of the development. So, you know, if something were to happen, let's say you had, now the good news is we don't have sewer and water in the road there, so we're less likely to run into a problem. I suppose there could be a car crash that couldn't be moved in the middle of the roadway. But our interim fire chief was comfortable with continuing to explore that, again, because we don't have control over the land to the south, or the developer doesn't.
Thank you. Those are just some of the things that jumped out at me. So all kind of typical, we ask about everything, so, or every project, so. Nothing else from me at this stage. Thank you.
So one of the other, excuse me, ongoing concerns has been the noise level from the railroads. And certainly trees are a, maybe more the appearance of a buffer than an actual effect at the same time. And the, you know, and when I look at it, so whose problem is this? If people are buying or renting and saying it's not a problem, but it literally kind of comes back, and we should have done this when we were originally proposing it. And there was other developments along the railroad tracks that we didn't totally address, and now's the time.
Sure. And Chair and Commissioner Iverson, to touch on the 2 points that I mentioned about no buffers to the north or south, I just want to highlight that a majority of the tree preservation that they're doing is located along the north property line. Mm-hmm. And they won't be including a berm in the area, but they will be including some landscape plantings to try to accommodate for those noise levels and for the missing landscaping along the north end of the property. And then the south end of the property, we've had some discussions internally about our landscaping requirements, our buffer requirements as it relates to areas that are outside the city. areas that are currently in Laketown Township. So with this parcel specifically, when they get annexed into the city, what is their buffer requirement since they're not adjacent to any other areas within the city? They're not adjacent to any other R1, R2, R3 zone properties, commercial, flex employment, industrial zone properties. So how do we interpret our landscape buffer ordinance as it relates to future growth? My interpretation is that the more intense use, whether it's currently shown or future developed, would have to provide the buffer in this instance. So to the south, we have guided for flex employment, which is typical of like a business park or industrial setting. That's more intense than residential. So if a development does occur to the south that is a business park or industrial type use, they would be the one to provide the buffer because they're the more intense use.
Ryan, just to build on John's question, you indicated that 90 feet was the closest unit from the center of the tracks. Is that, how does it give us a frame of reference? Marsh Hollow to the south, is that about the same distance? How are we comparing?
We did some general measurements before the meeting this evening just for comparison. And the back of this house here, I believe the closest corner to the center line of the railroad tracks comes out at about 140 feet, just for reference. So the back of the townhome in this instance would be 80 to 90 feet to the center line of the railroad.
Pretty close.
Correct.
Do we have a sense for what is it? I mean, it's intermittent, but what's the decimal level when it's not buffered? I mean, do we have any sense of what that is?
No, that's a great question, and honestly, no, we don't. Unfortunately, we haven't explored that as staff, and I don't know if we have the capacity to do that.
That's what I was wondering.
For a point of reference, we're at essentially in the vicinity of 5 in Bavaria, and of course the railroad tracks further down south on Bavaria are you can hear in the middle of the night if the windows are open. It's you would think that you're very close, and that's what maybe 2 miles to 3 miles away. So, yeah. I don't know what the solution is. And again, the other developments we had gone through, what do we do and how we do it, and it's a bit of the old proverbial. It'll get developed, no matter what, So.
And Chair and Commissioners, I do want to make 2 additional points on this matter since we're talking about the Marsh Hollow development. They do have a berm for a portion of the south side of the site on the Marsh Hollow development. And then talking about frequency of the trains, we have met with the railroad staff in the last few months, and they said a train goes through here maybe 2 to 3 times a day. I don't know if that's 2 day trips, 1 night trip, or how that works out.
And so Berman, some of the areas that, again, 140 feet, is that place burned? That the one you were mentioning in reference?
I don't believe it is actually, and the applicant can confirm with me on this because they also worked on the Marsh Hollow development, but I believe it actually starts a little further west of that home.
Did you have some thoughts on that? Noise?
Yes. So when we did the Marsh Hollow development, the homes were more at the level of the train track. And so a berm there seemed to make some sense with some trees on the top to try to mitigate, really more visual, because the type of noise that a train makes is more intense for a shorter period of time. It's not like a constant highway type noise like 11 is going to be making all day long. So a berm doesn't really do much other than kind of break up a little aesthetic visual. So our thoughts on this site is obviously it's a higher density, so we just don't have the land to burn on a berm. But we do have existing trees on that heavily wooded slope that takes up most of the site there, that we are going to preserve, and we've stayed back from that with any grading to do that. And the homes that we have along those woods are about 15 feet above the train track. So if we were to try to put a berm in, we'd have to move all those houses back probably 50 feet. We'd lose the whole row of houses. I mean, you just couldn't physically do it. To create a berm at the top of a hill, then come back down to our developable land. So we felt that this is the best way that we could do it and to deal with it. And people are, will be moving in there with eyes wide open of what they're getting. We actually could talk a little bit about Ian Peterson here. He's runs the rental community to the north in Marsh Hollow, and he could talk a little bit about renters' reactions, I guess, to the train track and how that affects leasing, that kind of thing, if that's something you'd be interested in hearing about.
Sure, and a point of reference would be the apartments along the railroad tracks on off of Bavaria, going south, and it's, well, there they are, and there's a bunch of cars parked, so it may not necessarily be an issue, but it again, from my point of view, if there's anything we can do today, rather than say, well, it's kind of the perception of the berm and the trees, but if there's something beyond just the perception, an actual solution of some type.
One thing that is in the works is, as a part of the county road project, looking into a no-whistle crossing right there. Yep. So that is actively being discussed as part of that. So,
yeah, I think that, and that was relative to this development, the other development that they would enact that, and that would solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, the whistle is really 90% of the noise that comes from the train. It's so. Thanks.
John, you had a list of deviations.
I guess I got a couple questions for the HOA wetland. Is the city going to dictate the maintenance on it? I mean, it's kind of like they're required to maintain it, but is the city going to say your holding pond needs to be dredged or whatever?
Yeah, so Carver County WMO will require a maintenance agreement associated with that. So if it's a city-owned outlot, the requirements aren't nearly identical, but they'll require an agreement, and that agreement will include a maintenance schedule. Under the city's MS4 permit, the Public Works Department does need to keep track of that maintenance agreement and check in with the people who are responsible for maintaining the stormwater feature to make sure that it's being maintained. So we have a handful that are privately maintained. The Able-Light property, those are private streets, private townhome units, private streets, apartment building. Those people are responsible for maintaining that facility. Our churches, their stormwater management facilities are privately maintained, schools, so Holy Family, Victoria Elementary. So we have a handful of them, but the world has gotten better in that area by creating these agreements and documents that lay out for the HOA what the responsibilities are. So I imagine, Ian, you've encountered that in other communities throughout the metro. These standards have evolved. So,
and then a question on, I guess, the private streets and utilities. I know water and sewer, but you got, like you said, cable, gas, electric. Where is the easements for those going? Are they around the backyards? Are they around?
They would still go right behind the curb. So we have a kind of a cross section that we've designed for this. It's similar to, one way to think of these private streets is really to look at the private drives on the other projects, like on Marsh Hollow, for example. It's a 24-foot private drive. And in there, the private utilities just run right behind the curb and under the driveways and into the units. So there is space dedicated for that. And it is tight enough where we will detail it. You know, this is where the tree goes, this is where the gas line goes. So we will have that a little bit more detailed than a standard city street type of an easement. Because we have a lot going on in that spot, so we got to plan for that.
Right. And I guess, to me, working in these neighborhoods, when you go to do something down the road, whether it's replace the driveway, replace the street, replace curb, replace whatever, do the roofs, you know, you have no parking. You got, you know, it's very, very tight area to deal with. And it's complicated because you got homeowners that, you know, aren't happy because you're blocking their driveway or you're blocking their street, and you guys don't see it because it's 15 years down the road. It's, you know, and, you know, it just gets, I know there's some standards. It's one thing to do the finger streets like we did in Whispering Hollows, but to do this long loop street as a private street and this connector street, that's where I really struggle with, you know, just because it's the viability of trying to do stuff in the future. And when the homeowner association, you know, who's going to assess, keep an assessment on, do they got money to cover these streets down the road? If they need to be maintained in 15 years or 20 years, or it's just a lot of extra work. And I know there's cities that are doing it. They're happening all over. I just dread the day that you have to do something in them after a storm comes through, or you got to do all this stuff and shuffling cars to, you know, replace driveways, or you're going to do a street, and how do you keep the people in and out of it and fire in and out of it? And by doing it, you know, we're also, in essence, starting a precedence of what we're going to have in the future. And is this what we want in the future? Or is this the proper thing to do in the future? I don't know long term how many of these have been around long enough to understand, is this a good deal or not a good deal? That's where I'm at on it. Just to be honest,
Yeah. And here's what I can tell you. I can speak to some of those concerns, I think. Number one, a lot of that is really just the nature of townhome development. You know, if we want to have townhomes, this is what they look like. You know, so all the other cities, they've got this type of a standard with private streets and private driveways, and things are tight. And, you know, you have to have a homeowners association that is fully funded and robust and, you know, legally done properly, to make sure you have those reserves. And, you know, that's all done up front. I'm sure we'd be working with the city to establish those funds, especially since we're maintaining ponds and doing all these things. In terms of the amount of money, another thing to consider is, you know, the Marsh Hollow and Whispering Hills developments are also maintaining private streets. I mean, they're maintaining private drives. These are just connected. You know, instead of being fingers, they're all connected into one loop, is a way to think of that. In terms of parking, we've got over double. I mean, we've got a ton of parking. I mean, there's 4 spots per unit, plus 45 guest spots. And even if you could park on the street, there's so many driveways you couldn't really park there anyway. So it's just the nature of the beast. You gotta, if there's gonna be a project like that coming through, that just has to be planned for, and workers park in certain spots, and there's ways to coordinate that with means and methods to do that. What was your other concern? So it's access, maintenance, HOA, funds. So yeah, I understand the concerns for sure. I mean, it's certainly more of an undertaking than a single family development, but this particular layout, I wouldn't consider any more of a undertaking for an HOA than Whispering Hills or any other townhome project in the city of Victoria.
I mean, it truly is the nature of the beast. There's, make no mistake about that. But I think from the standpoint of preventatively, how do we prepare for the things that we know are going to be a problem? And I think if you look at HOAs, certainly not all HOAs are created equally. There's some that are very well, and they're governed by some state statutes at the same time, and then individual governing authority at the same time. And when I originally looked at this, HOA, was the very obvious, and that's going to take, and who's responsible for creating an HOA, quite frankly, that will have reserve funds to cover all of the things that will have to be covered. And the reality of it is that therein lies a very, very serious issue.
So this is a detail that I haven't brought up yet for some reason. I neglected to. Our project, this townhome project, is intended to be a rental community. And so I think it would be prudent to have Ian come up here and talk a little bit about how they do the maintenance on their rental communities in terms of funding and maintenance. If you could come up and talk about that for a second.
Before he starts, so these aren't condominiums, these are sideways rental apartments. I mean, one of the things that drew me to this, I don't think we have any other R4s in the city, do we? I don't think so. But drew me to it is not affordable housing in the noun, but more affordable housing for people who want to buy a house and can afford a house in Victoria. In this particular case, that's not probably going to happen as we go into phase 2 and 3. Okay, thank you.
Good evening. Ian Peterson with Integrate Properties. We did Marsh Hollow single-family homes, and that's a rental community. To get to Mr. Iverson's point, just real quickly, I'm going to go on a sidebar for a second about townhome layouts, maintenance, HOA. It is a different animal, and whether it's been for sale or for rent, we've done numerous communities like this throughout the greater Twin Cities area. It does get all down to the communication and then of the management company for those inconveniences, as we alluded to, regarding we have a water leak, we're gonna have to tear up the road. Everybody knows this day and age it's a little bit easier. Everybody's information regarding a cell phone, email, and so typically the management companies send out a notice, hey, we have a water leak at 123 Main Street. Road's going to be shut down. You may be inconvenienced. So whether it's for sale or for rent, that's kind of the way it gets communicated out. And so shared with Kara and staff a few weeks ago, also in some single family rental communities that are all on private streets similar to this. And to help ease some of the pain regarding future maintenance, et cetera, one of the things that we do is a 5-year maintenance plan that we submit to the city with regards to the streets and the street condition. You know, do we need to overlay it, chip seal it, whatever the engineer recommends. And so in this case, even though they're private streets, we would still do that. Just so, and then definitely show the reserve accounts as we go, to show that, we have the financial capability to do the maintenance for X number of water leaks per year, replace driveways, overlay driveways, fix the roads, those type of things. So those are all pieces and parts of the puzzle from a maintenance and operation standpoint that we take into account when we're collecting rent every month. A certain portion of that rent goes into future operations and maintenance plans, everything down to replacing the roofs, to painting, to replacing the siding, those type of things.
Well, I mean, I certainly can't speak for the rest of the commissioners, but, I would only say that this makes sense in terms of a development. It makes sense in terms of a need that the city of Victoria does have. But, for our task is to solve problems.
Yep.
At this stage versus 5 years from now at
Sure.
the same time. And I think that's going to be I think anyone with property knows that inflation, whatever your numbers are today, you put in X number of dollars per unit that you will be spending 6 years from now. That number will increase substantially. So the management of this, I think, is, while we don't necessarily control that, it has to be controlled.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. We have a management company, maintenance company that takes all those things into account. We evaluate beginning in November each year, things like inflation, rent increases, property tax increases, all of those things get put into the Rubik's Cube, so to speak. So we're assured that we can take care of the homeowners that we have there.
Renters. I mean, is there even a homeowners association if you're renting out all the places?
There typically is not a homeowners association since we own all of the units and the land itself.
Like 99% of our concerns about streets and all that stuff, who cares? It's the person who owns it who has to deal with it. It's not the homeowner or the person who's renting.
Correct.
That's your problem.
Correct.
It's unique to this kind of development.
Yeah, it's a sideways apartment. Those streets are just hallways, except for when you're accessing the place.
But if there's a problem somewhere along the line, Brian will hear about it.
Yeah, well, it's.
And so, our work, I mean, just, again, I think is preventative.
Sure.
As preventative as we can.
Won't hear about it. They're not Victoria resident. Well, they're Victoria residents, but they aren't homeowners. I was concerned for the homeowners, which is, there aren't any.
You had some questions, John?
I just had one question. It's kind of a deviation. I know that staff during the discussions had expressed concern about architectural quality and meeting the city's ordinance around highest quality standards. Just wondered if maybe it's premature, maybe that comes in the final or a future iteration of the plans. Just wondered where we are on that. Any update?
Yes, Chair and Commissioners, Commissioner Eierstetter, I can comment on that. So as I mentioned, the renderings that they've provided are just conceptual. And given that some of the recent products that you've seen for multifamily dwelling apartment units have been in our central business district, which has different standards from our R4 district, we thought would just be beneficial for you all to see what they've provided us and see if you had any specific comments for them to consider when they move forward with final plat.
Okay, fair enough. So too early, basically.
Correct. But if you do have any comments, I think they would find it beneficial to know now before they move forward.
Whether we want like brick facades or, is that what you're talking?
Correct.
Well, I think, you know, one of the examples is the apartments that are in the process of being built. And every you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but every 5 years, the configuration of colors, design, and everything else changes. And so with the original concept that we saw of the apartments, it looked like one of those that would look obsolete in 5 years. And there's a whole bunch of that being done. And so, you know, the exterior material, I think is a real key to the whole thing. And you know, you know, you can go to St. Bonnie, for example, and within 10 years there will be a bunch of siding, well, maybe more, that'll be replaced, but it'll have that 2024 look, you know, instead of a 2030 look at the same time. So I think that's another real key part, I think, of the whole thing. And
But you're never gonna stay ahead of whatever the next trend is out there.
no,
Yeah, look at me. I stay away from style. I mean, I have no idea what's going on with that. It's for other experts. Make it look pretty.
yeah.
I mean, today.
We'll make sure that, you know, we can stop fires. People can get in and out. They got water. They can flush their toilets. You guys make it all look pretty. It's park board. Sorry.
And 10 years from now, they want to redo all the siding. That's part of the, I mean, you can't control a lot of it. It's just whether you want, you know, brick so far up, but as far as the color of brick, you know, or it's whatever's going to be the latest trend out there, I think, is what you're going to end up with. And, you know, I mean, everything's going white and gray, and you don't see any bright colors or earth tones or anything out there anymore. That's what's out there. And 10 years from now, it'll be something totally different.
And in noting this, there are only a few on the corners that seem to have any balconies. So that is the plan, but probably relatively how many?
I'll let the architect and apartment developer answer.
Okay.
About
20 out of 144. Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of this has to do with having enough money to pay for repairs and service upgrades down the line. Is there going to be proper maintenance on private streets for fire to get there in the dead of winter? Those are the things that, you know, year by year are going to matter.
But it does make a big difference since it's a rental versus an homeowners. I mean, it's kind of changed kind of the concept a little bit, because instead of dealing with,
Could I make a suggestion, like maybe if you want to add a condition to the approval that we work with city staff to, prepare that maintenance schedule and that
And
sort of a thing.
that's what I'm getting at. At some point, those are issues that the legal portion of our city is going to be having to work out in terms of how those agreements are structured to provide for, risk and appropriate liability, and what are the remedies if something doesn't go well. That to me is down the stream, but that's not necessarily my role right now.
Gonna pull the motions up.
And maybe one last thing. So in the apartment, there was 15 less underground stalls. Is that just based on pure space that it wasn't? But then there's, like you said, excess outside. Okay.
Got a question about that. Would it be feasible, I know you got 144 units. I'm assuming they're 2-bedroom, 3, 4.
Studio.
The apartments, yes.
These two.
Good evening, Chair, members of the commission. I'm Blaine Barker with Real Estate Equities with the apartment developer. About 25% of the units are 1 bed, 50% 2, and 25% 3, give or take.
That's what I was wondering. I mean, in order to get into the park, the parking standard, would it be feasible to increase like less 1 bedrooms, more 2 bedrooms, or does that not really calculate that way? Or is it more?
Yeah, we don't have much interest in changing our unit mix. That's a pretty standard unit mix that we do based on demand that we see. We build these developments for families. We like the bigger unit types. Those are in high demand and short supply throughout the metro. I believe our parking ratio proposed here is about 1.9 stalls per unit. We typically build around 1.8. So we are a little higher than what we've built historically, slightly. What we found is typically residents, on average, the actual cars they own are about 1.4 to 1.5 stalls a unit, but then you have to have additional for, our employees, potential vendors, guests. So we've found 1.8 has been kind of the sweet spot for us, and we're at 1.9 here. So based on our unit mix and our historical, what we've seen at our properties, we feel it's adequate.
And then, so like the community center, pool, those are dog parks, being that it's private, those are accessible to all residents. Okay.
And I believe that I did see something in the presentation material on EV charging stations, the accommodation for EVs.
Yes, we're seeing this more. I think we'd be open to EV ready spaces. We actually just opened a building, 114 units, 18 EV charging stations, fully occupied, and one's currently getting used. So while we see where the world is going and understand future proofing our properties to allow this in the future when the demand is there, and I think, whether it's 5-10 years, it's trending that direction. What we're seeing now based on today, it's, dollars being spent that aren't being utilized, which if we're going to spend the money, we want it to be on something our residents can utilize. So we have hesitation to committing to actually installing the chargers just based on the usage we're currently seeing at a few properties where we have built them.
So just a couple follow-ups on that is, so when EV ready, it means conduit placement of stubs on where it would go, but not necessarily the infrastructure breakers, things behind the scenes.
No, so it's, Commissioner, so we'd have to get the transformer. We'd have to get all the conduit to the potential where we'd locate it and all the switch gear. So really, it's not the actual wiring through the conduit, and it's not the charger
The
itself.
transformer, okay, that's a big distinction.
Yep.
For me, thank you.
And
You
I
had
guess-
some questions about some of the things. Did you get all those?
Yeah, Mike, yes, yes, thanks.
And if I'd like to clarify, not to leave it open-ended, we'd propose for this property maybe 20 future spaces, 20 to 25. Want to make sure I'm not leading you to think that we're doing it on all the
Yeah,
stalls that we're.
thanks for the clarification, but
You've read the same reports we have.
What's the feasibility of the apartments?
who's coming in line?
The phase of, when would, I mean, you got the townhomes going in.
Yep.
I mean, this is, it's there, but it's not there.
Yeah, so we have, in that map that we show the 3 phases, phase 1, we don't pull that up quick and I can just
Yeah.
kind of, it's a little bit in flux because there's some timing things that are going to happen here with the construction season and getting the well and getting the utilities in here. So phase 1 and 2 could go at the same time, and they could start as soon as this fall. And then just depending on a lot of factors, funding and things for the apartment, that could begin construction next summer.
But you would grade and phase the streets all in
We
probably.
would probably grade the entire site at once for grading balance, get all of our stormwater in place, that sort of thing, and then put the infrastructure in phases.
Okay.
I would like to make a motion to recommend the city council approve the request with staff proposed conditions.
And maintenance agreement. Conditions?
Commissioner Iverson, did you want to include in your motion a condition that we discuss maintenance conditions over a period of years?
Yeah, that was one of the things, yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do I have a motion?
I will second that motion.
Made by Commissioner Iverson, second by Commissioner Ream. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Moving on to our miscellaneous items tonight. Staff, is there any miscellaneous items?
I don't believe we do. Our next meeting is May 21st, 2 weeks from today. We got a couple items on the agenda for that evening, but we'll talk about those when we get to them.
Okay, thank you.
Fair enough.
As far as public notices, I saw that it looks like they are now being published in the Sun Patriot.
Correct. Yes. So the Chanhassen Villager, as I mentioned in the presentations tonight, their final edition was a few weeks ago now, about 2 weeks this Thursday. So we have designated the Sun Patriot as the city's new official newspaper. So that's where our notices will be posted in the future.
Do you know, are they planning to send papers to Victoria or not?
I believe that's the intention. I'd have to confirm with other staff members in our administration department, but I believe that's.
Maybe next week at City Council they'll have more answers. The only other thing I have is we should have all gotten an email from Alyssa about a volunteer gathering that's coming up here in June 10th. So if you plan on going, RSVP, if you haven't seen the email, please look for it.
Yep. We want to recognize all of our commissioners for the hard work that you guys do. So please put that on your calendars if you haven't already, and we'd love to see you there.
Any other miscellaneous items from anybody? Could I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. We are adjourned.
We did it.